All right, so today we're talking again in this series, Undivided. Today we're talking about undivided worship. If you were with us last week, we talked about how God desires an undivided heart. We looked at the command of Jesus when he was asked, hey, what's the most important commandment? What's the one thing that God wants more than anything else? And Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. He says, love God with an undivided heart. And from the very beginning, we saw this is what God has always wanted from his people, was our whole undivided hearts. The problem that we saw last week is that our hearts are ultimately unable to be undivided. Ultimately, we have hearts that are unable to be undivided because we have this thing in our hearts called sin. This thing in our hearts that causes us to rebel against God, to say, God, we know better. We're not going to worship you alone. We're going to try and love not God only, but God and. I'm going to try to love God and this other thing. And we saw that our hearts are unable to be undivided because of the sin that's inside of them. And the only solution to our problem is to receive a new heart. That our hearts are divided, our hearts are broken, our hearts are stone, they're dead. And the only way to have this life, the only way to love God with our whole hearts is to receive a new heart, which is exactly what God promises to do through Jesus. Through Jesus, the only person who has ever lived, who has had a whole heart, he takes our divided hearts and he makes them whole. He gives us undivided hearts. And so that's what we talked about last week, is this idea of an undivided heart. And we said if you are a follower of Jesus, if you have put your faith and trust in him, he has given you his heart. He has made your heart undivided, a heart that's capable of loving God. And so what we're going to start doing now, we're going to do this week, next week, and the next week, is start asking, what does it look like to live a life that has an undivided heart? What does it look like as followers of Jesus, as people whose hearts have been made new? What does life look like now? And so today, we're going to start by talking about worship. Like we said at the top, we're going to start with undivided worship. Because here's the thing. As a human being, worship is at the core of who you are. As a person, not just as a follower of Jesus, but as a human, worship is at the core of who you are. And that might sound kind of weird, especially if you think about worship in terms of like what we do in this room together. Especially if you think of worship as in just like singing songs to Jesus. It might be weird to be like singing songs is at the core of who you are. Because some of you guys I've watched, you're like, I don't sing and I can't play an instrument. So I don't know what you mean worship is at the core of who I am. But the issue with that is that's not really an understanding of what worship really is. That's part of worship. And singing is a huge way that we worship. But ultimately, worship is bigger than singing. Y'all know this? Worship is bigger than the songs that we sing. Ultimately, worship comes down to these three things: honor, sacrifice, and obedience. The things that we honor, the things that we sacrifice for, the things that we obey, that's what we're worshiping. And so that fits with what we do in this room, right? We come and we sing these songs to God to honor him, to give him glory, to declare you are worthy of this. You are awesome and powerful and lovely. And I'm going to raise this hallelujah to declare that you're good. I'm going to sacrifice. I'm going to sacrifice this extra few hours of sleep I could have to come and be here. I'm going to sacrifice what I could be doing. I'm going to come into this room. I'm even going to maybe sacrifice what people think about me. I might raise my hands in worship. I might open up my hands and say, God, I don't care what people around me think. I want to sacrifice my image for you. We come in and we obey. We say, God has called us together. He's called us to sing. He says, I love it when you sing songs to me. So we obey him and we do that. We're worshiping God. But the thing is that we're surrounded in our culture by other things that are competing for our worship. And we may not have a bunch of stuff in our world that's saying, come and sing songs to me. But we've got a whole lot of things in our world that are saying, come honor me. Come sacrifice things for me. Come obey me. Think about it. What besides God might you be being tempted to worship? Maybe it's that sport. And you place it in a position of honor. Football, basketball, baseball, soccer, lacrosse, whatever it is, this is something that is worthy. This is something that's worthy of me putting up on this pedestal. I want to honor it. I'm going to sacrifice for it. I'm going to lay down other things that I could be doing. I'm going to sacrifice time that I could be spending at home. I'm going to sacrifice time I could be spending on schoolwork. I'm going to sacrifice time I could be spending at church. I'm going to sacrifice for this. I'm going to work hard because I want to be good because this thing is worthy. I'm going to obey it. When it demands that I give this sport everything I've got, I'm going to do that. When it demands if you want to be good at this, you got to leave behind all this other stuff, I'm going to obey it. Not because I just like playing it, but because I want to worship this thing. Could it be popularity? You've taken popularity, you put it up here, and you said, this is worthy, this is worthwhile, this is something I want to honor, I want to give glory to, I want to esteem. The most important thing in my life is to be popular. The most important thing is for people to like me, and so I'm going to honor it, I'm going to sacrifice for it. I might cut a person out of my life who's not cool enough, and therefore isn't going to help me be popular. I might sacrifice someone else's feelings. I might hurt somebody else so that I can get the laughs, so that people would think that I'm cool because I'm chasing after popularity. I'm going to sacrifice for it. I'm going to obey the rules. I'm going to obey what popularity demands of me. It doesn't matter if it's another person. It doesn't matter if it's what I think is right or wrong. I'm going to sacrifice for it because I am chasing after popularity. Worship, ultimately, is about what we're putting in the place of most importance. What are we honoring? What are we sacrificing for? What are we obeying? And we live in a world where we are surrounded by things that are competing for our worship. Maybe not our singing, but our honor and our sacrifice and our obedience. And the way that we usually approach this is to take a both-and approach, right? We're going to worship God, and we're also going to worship popularity. We're going to worship God, and we're also going to worship athletics. I'm going to worship God, and I'm also going to worship what I want to watch on the internet. I'm going to worship God, and I'm going to worship God. I'm going to worship something else. We try to worship both, and in reality, we live in a world with so many things that we don't just try to worship both, and we try to worship God and this, and this, and this, and this, and there's so many things. We end up looking like Rob Lowe at an NFL game wearing his NFL hat. Go teams, right? We're called to have a whole heart. But instead, we have a divided heart. We're called to love God alone, to worship God alone, but instead we worship God and as we talked about last week, both and kills our hearts. Our hearts were made to be undivided. Our worship was made to be undivided, and we try to divide it up. We try to go both and in the end, what it does is it kills our hearts. Is anybody familiar with what I'm talking about today? Does that ring true to anybody in this room, that we're trying to divide our worship and worship both God and some other stuff? And if you know that's where you're at, then you know this is what your heart feels like sometimes. You know you've been trying to worship God but your heart just feels dead inside. And the thing is, the reality is that from the beginning, us as God's people, from the beginning, God's people have dealt with these divided hearts. From the very beginning, we've dealt with this divided worship, where we've tried to worship both God and. A few weeks ago, we talked about a story of the people of Israel coming to Mount Sinai. This is right after God has rescued his people from Egypt. So if you're not familiar with the story, God chose this guy, Abraham. He said, Abraham, I want you to leave the place that you've been. I want you to come and follow after me. If you'll do this, I'll be your God. You'll be my people. Abraham leaves his home. He leaves the place he has always been. He has a ton of descendants. They become known as Israel. And Israel ultimately moves into Egypt as there's a famine in the land. And eventually the Egyptians, they realized that the people of Israel were growing, they were getting very powerful, and so they enslaved the people of Israel. Fast forward a lot of time, and God rescues his people out of slavery, brings them out into the desert, and says, I'm going to take you to a land of your own. I'm going to give you a promised land, a perfect place, a place that I've designed for you. God says, you are my people, I am your God, and he brings them out into the desert, and he leads them to the base of Mount Sinai. And as they come to this base of this mountain, God says, hey, I want Moses, I want the leader, I want him to come up to the top of this mountain because I'm going to meet with him. I've got something to give him. And so Moses, the leader of the people of Israel, goes up to the top of Mount Sinai, and as he does it, the mountain is covered in a storm. God's very presence is on top of this mountain. Moses is meeting with God, and there is a thunderstorm. It is powerful. And on top of this mountain, this is the moment that God gives Moses the 10 Commandments. God gives Moses this list of 10 things. He says, hey, if you're going to be my people, if you're going to follow after me, here's the 10 things. And the 10 Commandments start like this. You shall have no other gods before me. All those other things that are competing for your worship, they can't be ahead of me. They can't be in my place. You shall have no other gods before me. And then God goes further with the second one. He says, you know what, not before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth below or in the waters beneath. God says there is nothing, there is no one who should be competing for your worship. I alone am God. There should be no other gods. You shouldn't have anyone ahead of me. You shouldn't have anyone behind me. I want your whole heart. I want your undivided worship. right? God pulls his people up to the top of this mountain. He says, here's the 10 most important things. Number 1, I am God alone. Number 2, I am God alone. Most importantly, I want your undivided worship. And so Moses, he's on top of the mountain meeting with God, getting this commandment, and then Moses walks down the mountain. He walks down the mountain, and here's what he finds. He finds that his people at the bottom of the mountain are worshiping a statue of a cow. He finds that while he was on top of the mountain meeting with God, the people of Israel, they got a little antsy. They got a little bit like, look, we want to worship God, but here's the thing. God seems a little preoccupied right now. Like, we're kind of hungry down here, and God seems a little busy. So we're going to not just worship God, we're going to worship God in this statue. We're going to worship God in this cow, and we're going to ask the cow to do what we want. We're going to ask the cow to feed us. We're going to ask the cow to make sure that we're safe. Because God's great and all, but God seems a little busy. God's timing isn't really working for me. Waiting on God isn't good enough, so I'm going to make this other God. I'm going to worship God and. Moses was on top of the mountain hearing that God wanted our undivided worship. But as soon as he walked down the mountain, that fell apart, and the people had already divided their worship. They had already pursued God and. And this temptation to pursue God and is something we call idolatry. That we take something that's not God and we put it in the place of God. Trying to worship both and is idolatry. It's taking something that doesn't deserve God's worship and putting it in God's place. And from the very beginning, God's people have dealt with this problem of idolatry. From the very beginning. It started with the people when they were at Sinai, and it progressed through the leadership of Moses into the leadership of the judges and into the leadership of the kings. And as the kings took over, it just got worse and worse and worse. And ultimately, it culminated in a guy whose name was Ahab. Ahab was a king of Israel. He was a king of God's people. This people who are called to love God with an undivided heart, to worship God with undivided worship. Ahab was their king, and he married a woman whose name was Jezebel. And what's important about Jezebel is that she's from a place called Sidon. Sidon, if you see it, it's a city in the country called Phoenicia, and Sidon is a place where they didn't worship God. Instead, they worshiped idols. And the thing we need to know about Sidon is that it was on the sea. And one of the main things that happened in Sidon is they boated. They went around, they explored the world, they went out on ships. The Phoenicians were famous for this. They made their living from the water. And so they worshiped a god whose name was Baal. And Baal, they believed, was the god of rain. They would come to Baal saying, Baal, would you give us what we need? We need water. We need the ocean to do what we need it to do. We need your power, because without the water, we're in trouble. We need the rain, because if the rain doesn't come, we're all going to die. We rely on the water. We rely on these ships, so we're going to worship the god of Baal. And so Ahab marries Jezebel, and when Jezebel comes in to Israel, she brings with her the worship of Baal. And so for a while, the people of Israel worshiped God and Baal. They worshiped God and Baal. They would go and they would worship God in the temple, and then they would go out and they would worship Baal in the valley. And eventually what happened is Jezebel said, you know what? God and isn't enough. Instead, I want you to worship Baal alone. So Ahab and Jezebel, the leaders of God's people, they said, you know what? We're done worshiping God. You're not allowed to do that anymore. We're just going to worship Baal now. We're just going to worship the God of the rain. Can you imagine the people of God saying, we no longer want to worship God, we want to worship a statue who supposedly brings rain? But that's what happened. In this moment, God called a prophet named Elijah. Now, a prophet was someone who God spoke to and who then spoke to God's people for him. So God would give the message to the prophet would then declare the message to the people. And God called Elijah to be a prophet, and he gave him a specific message. God called Elijah to go to Ahab, go to this king and queen who are saying, you cannot worship God anymore, you must worship the God of rain. And he says, go to Ahab and say, there will neither be dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. God says, you want to worship this God of rain? All right, here's what we're going to do. No more rain. You think Baal is worthy of your worship? You think Baal deserves your honor? You think he's worthy? Well, guess what? Baal has no power here. It's not even going to rain unless I say it. At this moment, God says there's going to be a competition. We're going to have a competition between the Baal who says that he controls the rain and the God who actually does. We're going to have a competition. There's going to be no rain in the land. And for 3 years, it didn't rain. For 3 years, there was no rain. There was no dew. It was a drought. The plants died. People got hungry. Animals started getting sick. There was no rain. And the whole time, the people of Israel, who should have been crying out to God, continued crying out to Baal. They just thought maybe Baal isn't listening. Maybe we're not doing enough. They worshiped Baal more. They worshiped him even harder. And they said, Baal, would you come bring us rain? And for 3 years, there was nothing. And then finally, 3 years later, God said to Elijah, okay, now go and present yourself to Ahab. Go back to the king, and I'm going to send rain on the land. Tell the people, summon them to come from all over Israel and meet me on top of Mount Carmel. I want you to come to the top of this mountain because it's time to have a showdown. It's time to prove to you who the true God is. It's time to prove to you who's worthy of worship. And so Elijah, he sets up a competition. They go to the top of Mount Carmel, and Elijah goes and he says, hey, you guys who worship Baal, you guys worship Baal. I'm going to worship God. Here's how we're going to do this. We're each going to get a bull. We're going to take the bull. We're going to cut it up. We're going to put it on a stack of wood. And then we're going to both cry out to our gods. I'll cry out to the real God. You guys cry out to that statue over there. The God who responds with fire is the real God. He says, come on out to this mountain. We're going to set up this competition. The God who sends fire down from heaven is the God that we're going to worship. And so the prophets of Baal, they say, that's cool. We'll go with that. We'll do this. We'll have this competition because obviously our God's bigger than your God, right? And so at the very beginning of the day, the prophets of Baal, they begin to cry out, oh, Baal, would you send us fire? Baal! Baal! Hey! Fire! Nothing. So they began to dance around. Baal! Nothing. They began to cut themselves open, sacrifice their own bodies, waiting for Baal to respond, but still there was nothing. All day long they cried out to Baal, but Baal was silent. And finally Elijah steps up and says, okay, you guys have had your fun. God's turn. Nearby there was a river flowing with water, and Elijah said to the people, he said, go and fill up 4 large jars of water from the river. Go fill it up with this supposedly what Baal is in charge of. Go get some water, pour it on top of the altar. Let me show you how cool God is. And so they fill up these 4 giant jars of water, they pour it on the altar, and then Elijah says, okay, great, do it again. Go get another 4 jars. Pour those 4 jars on the altar. They do it. He says, do it a 3rd time. At the time that they were done, water is flowing all over the altar of God. Elijah has said the God who responds with fire is the real God. He's poured Baal's water all over this altar. He's made it as impossible as it could be for God to do what he promised him to do. The water is dripping down the altar. And Elijah prays. He says, oh God, would you answer me? Not so that I can look cool, but so that these people would know that you, Lord, are God. And by default, that Baal is not. Would you show that you are God, that Baal is not, and that you're turning their hearts back? Undivide our hearts. Undivide our worship. God, would you show us who you are? And as Elijah finishes praying, the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice. The wood, the stones, the soil, it even licked up the water in the trench. Fire fell that was so powerful that even the rocks got burned up. God pours out his fire from heaven, soaks up all the water, and the people reply by saying, the Lord, he is God. You see, the people have been tempted to worship God and then they were told to worship Baal alone. But in this moment, Elijah came and he showed them that God is greater than all others. That there is no one who can compete with God. See, last week we saw that God isn't interested in just having a fraction of our hearts, that he wants our whole hearts. Today I want you to see this. God isn't going to share his worship with anybody. God isn't going to share his worship with anybody because no one else is worthy of his worship. See, they thought that Baal was going to be worthy. They thought that Baal was worth worshiping, but Elijah came in and he said, no, you don't understand. God is more powerful. Baal has no real power here. Worship God. He says this undivided heart, it's not going to work anymore. We need a whole heart. We need undivided worship. God is worthy of our worship and nobody else is. And this is an idea that Jesus picks up in Matthew chapter 6 when Jesus is teaching, and he says, no one can serve two masters. Either you're going to hate one of the masters and you're going to love the other, or you're going to be devoted to one and you're going to despise the other. You can't serve both God and money. Jesus is teaching here about this idea that people are worshiping money. They want to serve money. They want to submit their hearts and their desires. They want to give money honor. They want to sacrifice for money. They want to give money all this stuff. And Jesus says you can't serve both God and money. But whether it's God and money, or it's God and what I want to watch on the internet, or it's God and popularity, or it's God and the way that I treat other people, here's the truth. You cannot serve God, and we have to worship God alone. See, there's all sorts of things that compete for our worship, but God wants undivided worship because God alone is worthy of our worship. There are all sorts of things in our life, whether it's sports or it's relationships or it's popularity, that all compete for our worship, that all compete for our hearts. But here's the truth, guys. All of those things that set them up in competition with God, they're not really God's at all. Turns out they're worthless. Turns out they're powerless. All their promises they make are empty. So God calls us not to divide our heart, not to divide our worship, not to share our worship, but to worship Him and Him alone. Because God alone is worthy of our worship. He calls us to have undivided hearts. So my question this morning is, are you worshiping God alone? Or are you trying to worship God and? Are you worshiping God alone, or are you trying to divide your worship to worship God and sports, to worship God and that girl or that boy, to worship God and my popularity, to worship God and my grades, to worship God and being the good kid, to worship God and something else? Because here's the truth. God's not going to share His worship with anybody. He's the only one who's worthy of it. So here's what we're going to do. In just a moment, we're going to continue in worship. But right now, I just want to give you a moment to close your eyes and reflect. Ask yourself, what am I worshiping? Am I worshiping God alone, or am I worshiping God and? And would you ask God in this moment, Lord, would you help me to worship you alone?